And what I'd like to do today is to speak to you about my career as a historian and also about the history of cultural history. My career has somehow got entangled with this history, especially in the three different phases of its development. Cultural history began as the history of the arts and sciences, and then came the history of popular culture, and finally came the historical anthropology of different ways of life, different cultures. And I became interested in these three ways of writing cultural history in chronological order, and I still believe in the value of all of them. I wouldn't say that one of them is better than the other, but each has its own advantages and disadvantages. And speaking more generally, I want to suggest that cultural innovation usually consists not of replacing something old with something new, as you might replace a machine, but producing something new that will coexist with the old and then will interact with it. And in this case, the three kinds of cultural history that I just distinguished, they all continue to exist, and they are interacting and producing, if you like, new combinations. I still try to contribute to all three of them. So cultural history in the first sense, the history of the arts, sciences, philosophy, music, it was already written under that name, at least in German, in the late 18th century. And the masterpiece in the genre, I believe it's generally accepted by historians, is a book published as long ago as 1860. It's a study of the culture of the Renaissance in Italy by the Swiss historian Jakob Burckhardt. He called it just an essay. That was him being modest. And he was trying to reconstruct the mentality of the Italian elite at this time and showing how different it was from medieval attitudes and values. Now, this kind of history was not written for students. It was written for the general public in the 19th century. It was most popular in the German-speaking world. And it was not taken seriously by the growing number of professional historians in the 19th century, again, especially in Germany. So the professional historians were led by Leopold von Ranke. He had wide ambitions. He wrote about the religion as well as politics. But his followers reduced Ranke's project to a political history viewed from above and based on official documents. I believe that Marx once said, I'm not a Marxist. Ranke could equally well have said, I'm not a Rankian. His students, they shrank his project. Now, in the writing of history, every generation does it a bit differently, but at the same time, some major changes take a long time to happen. And they take longer to happen in some places, for example, some universities compared to others. So, as a student, I read history at Oxford. As late as 1957, when I arrived to study the subject, the history taught at Oxford was rather insular because it was focused very much on the history of England, not even Scotland or Wales or Ireland. And it was also narrowly political in the sense of what was done by great men, in other words, history viewed from above. There was an alternative, economic history. Economic historians were in a minority, but they were beginning to make their voices felt. social history was sort of attached to economic history. There were some history departments in other universities. There was one department of history, and there was another department of economic and social. But it was always and social, as if it didn't matter as much as the economic. But in the Oxford system, there was, happily for me, one major exception to the dominance of politics. Every student had to take a special subject. I know this is true in so many universities. It's an excellent idea. In your final year, you take a subject you study in more detail. It must be based on original sources. So there's a whole list of special subjects, and we were free to choose one from about 12 options. And one option, curiously enough, a very old option, was the Italian Renaissance. And because I love the art of this period, I'm a Londoner. My childhood, I spent a lot of time at the National Gallery, in British Museum, and so on. So I chose that topic. And in response, this is the great thing about the college system, my college gave me money so that I could spend a lot of time in Italy, first to learn the language, because I didn't know a word of Italian, and secondly, to view outstanding works of art in Venice, in Florence, in Rome. Now, if I was so interested in art, you might wonder why didn't I take an art history course at the university? And the answer is, as I wanted to go to Oxford, and Oxford didn't have a course on art history. What was new, very new, 2 years before I arrived, they appointed the first professor of art history ever, a brilliant man, German, called Edgar Wendt, and who'd taught in Germany, but in 1933, because he was Jewish, he was forced to emigrate, and he chose to come to England. But curiously enough, Wendt didn't really want students of his own. He didn't want to found an art history department. What he really wanted to do, did very well, was to lecture to the whole university, anybody that wanted to come. And he did this on the Italian Renaissance. And everybody came. That is, not 100% of the students, but I knew people who were studying chemistry, studying philosophy, mathematics, studying English literature. They all came. So much so, there was no room in the university that was big enough to hold all the people that wanted to come to the weekly lectures. So Professor Wendt ended up giving his lectures in the Oxford Playhouse, the one place with enough space for seats. Now, in fact, I went to seminars as well, and as a result, I became an enthusiast for the study of the Italian Renaissance. I started a doctorate, but there was no time to finish it, because at this time in England, now we reached the early 1960s, 7 new universities were founded by the government. And the first one to open, the University of Sussex at Brighton, had a different organization, because the founders believed in an interdisciplinary approach. They didn't want students to specialize as much as is normal now. So 50% of the time of the student, they studied their major subject, but the other half, that went on a variety of subjects. Not any subject the student felt like studying, that's the American system, but other subjects that the organizers thought would connect well with the major subject of each student and make everything easier to understand. I was very excited when I heard this or read about it in the newspaper. And I thought I had to apply. I must have a job at this university. And I applied and I got the job. So the next thing was I was giving lectures on the Italian Renaissance. And after giving lectures for 2 or 3 years on this subject, it occurred to me it would be nice to write a book about it. And I wanted to have a distinctive approach. And I thought the social history of culture. There was a book in existence in England called The Social History of Art. I don't think it's such a marvelous book. It's written by quite a hardline Marxist called Arnold Hauser. I think it's a bit too crude, but the enterprise is very important and very interesting. So I thought I could try to do this perhaps in my own way. And I called the book Culture and Society in the Italian Renaissance, and that was deliberate homage to a British intellectual, Raymond Williams. I don't say English because he was a Welshman, and he published this book in 1958, analyzing the concepts of culture and society, and I found it inspiring when I was a student. Now, Williams was a Marxist, but of a rather undogmatic kind. Indeed, he thought that it was a big mistake to treat culture as a kind of superstructure. And so his Marxism was what we called in the 60s open Marxism. I admired him. I appreciated the Marxian approach, maybe Marxian rather than Marxist. But I was also interested in an alternative, the approach of a group of French historians to history. The French historians associated with this journal, Annales. In those days, it was called Economies, Societies, Civilizations. Civilizations being the word the French used at that time when we English used the word culture. Curiously, maybe it's the American influence. Now the French do talk about culture, but they didn't at this point. And I remember asking myself, how would these historians approach the Renaissance if they decided to write a book about it? Obviously, you would study what kind of people the artists and writers were. Obviously, you would study who their patrons were, because the patronage system was the dominant system. There was an art market, but it was very small and very rare in most countries. There was a bit of an Italian art market, but really it's not the important thing. So the masterpieces of Leonardo and Michelangelo and Raphael were not produced to be sold in art galleries on a commercial basis. The initiative was with the patron, and he invited the artist to do something, and the artist very often had to do exactly what he was asked to do. So at Sussex, the idea of culture was very much a centre of attention. They even founded what we called a school of studies called Cultural and Community Studies. And somebody organized in the history, not a department, we were against departments, but the history group arranged a series of lectures on different approaches to different key concepts. And I was invited to give a talk about the idea of culture. So I did, and I pointed out that it's a metaphor from agriculture. It's the cultivation of the mind in the way that farmers cultivate the soil. And this idea goes back to classical Greece and Rome. Afterwards, a colleague of mine, Ranajit Guha, you probably know more about him than I do, but he was one of the first people to teach history at Sussex along with me. He said it's the same thing in Sanskrit. And he wrote me a little letter where he, in his distinctive green ink, he wrote the the word in the appropriate characters, which I can't read, but he told me that that was the word they were already using in ancient India. Now, sorry, I've got the pages wrong. Just turn these things over.